Midway through 2015, tensions were running high in Brooklyn, New York, as 67-year-old businessman Anatoly Potik exploded over the messy divorce of his daughter. His rage burned so intensely that he resorted to a drastic measure, a $100,000 contract to have his son-in-law murdered. For this dark task, Potik turned to Boris Nayfeld, a formidable figure from the Russian Jewish underworld. Niefeld, a towering, heavily tattooed enforcer, had earned his notoriety in the brutal Russian mafia wars of Brighton Beach during the 1980s and 1990s. Far from a mere thug, Nayfeld's criminal resume spanned the globe, from Odessa to Thailand, Moscow to Antwerp, and included surviving 5 assassination attempts, stints in US and Soviet prisons, and involvement in diamond heists, heroin trafficking, extortion, and deadly shootouts. His name alone was enough to instill fear. Potik had previously relied on Nayfeld for protection during Russia's chaotic 1990s, a time when survival required alliances with men of Nayfeld's caliber. However, Potik's son-in-law, a fabulously wealthy shipping magnate, was no easy target. His divorce and custody battle had become fodder for gossip among New York's elite on the Upper East Side. This son-in-law, well-connected and resourceful, caught wind of the murder plot. One of his influential friends, an older businessman, devised a cunning plan after a chance encounter with Nayfeld at an upscale Brooklyn bar frequented by wealthy and dangerous Russian mobsters. Instead of following through with the murder, why not offer the son-in-law a chance to buy his life back for $125,000, more than the original contract amount? The son-in-law agreed to the deal, but immediately alerted the authorities. He wore a wire to his subsequent meetings with Nayfeld, capturing every incriminating word. The FBI swooped in just as Nayfeld was about to leave an Italian restaurant after their 3rd meeting, arresting him in a dramatic climax. But the plot had been a sham from the beginning. There was no real intention of murder. Instead, Nayfeld and the older businessman planned to leverage Nayfeld's fearsome reputation to extort money both in the US and Russia from individuals who had allegedly stolen $20 million. Nayfeld, with his imposing stature, shaved head, and tattoos, including God Forgive Me in Hebrew inked during a stint in a Colorado prison, embodied this new class of criminal. Born in 1947 in Gomel, a desolate town in what is now Belarus, Boris's life began under the shadow of the Soviet regime's harshness. Food shortages and the aftermath of World War II created a grim environment, filled with orphans and broken families. His father, a black marketeer, was imprisoned in a gulag, leaving Boris and his brother in the care of their grandparents. The struggle to maintain their Jewish heritage in a hostile environment was a constant challenge. Boris's father briefly reappeared in his life, only to clash with his grandfather and vanish again. After his grandfather's death from cancer, Boris's grandmother struggled to keep him out of trouble. By age 9, his rebellious behavior led to his placement in a boarding school orphanage, a harsh institution for neglected children. Life in the orphanage was unforgiving, with constant fights and harsh conditions. Boris learned to defend himself and quickly gained a reputation as a fighter. By grade 7, he was expelled for being unmanageable. Back home, he continued to engage in petty crimes, in street fights, traits that would define his adolescence. Boris immersed himself in wrestling, a popular sport in the USSR, which often served as a breeding ground for future gangsters. By 14, Boris, known as B-Boy, was a notorious hooligan. His criminal activities escalated from petty thefts to more serious crimes, including knife fights and robberies. He was arrested for hooliganism and sent to a penal colony, a stark contrast to any notion of a reform school. In the penal colony, Boris faced brutal conditions that hardened him further: solitary confinement, harsh labor, and the infamous Vor-Ezekon code of thieves-in-law dominated his life. This criminal code, born from Stalin's gulags, required absolute rejection of any societal authority and demanded ruthless loyalty to the criminal criminal world. Boris emerged from this hellish experience tougher and more determined, ready to embrace a life of crime. Upon his release, Boris dodged mandatory military service, had a child, and worked in construction, where he served as an enforcer in Siberia. Despite the authoritarian regime's surveillance, he thrived by skimming and embezzling from state contracts. His ostentatious displays of wealth, fur jackets, gold jewelry, and designer shirts were bold acts of defiance against the communist regime. However, these acts drew the authorities' attention, leading to serious threats. Amidst rising Soviet anti-Semitism in the 1970s, Boris navigated a perilous path. The Soviet regime's crackdown on Jewish cultural activities and employment opportunities made life increasingly difficult, yet the changing political landscape, including Nixon's push for détente and the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, allowed many Jews to emigrate. In 1979, Boris seized this opportunity, smuggling his wealth out of the country in the form of stamps and diamonds. He journeyed through Austria and Italy before finally arriving in the United States, where he was placed in Albany by a Jewish community organization. After a brief stint as a janitor in Albany, Boris quickly realizes that this mundane job is not for him and heads to Brighton Beach, a burgeoning enclave of Soviet immigrants. By the late 1970s, Brighton Beach had become home to around 40,000 Soviet immigrants who transformed the neighborhood into a lively, albeit rough, community reminiscent of their homeland. Here, Boris quickly adapts, driving a cab and hustling his way through the local scene. The area was rife with two major criminal factions, and Boris, ever the opportunist, armed himself with a .38 special for $350, ready to carve out his own piece of the criminal underworld. Boris's early days in Brighton were marked by clashes with Puerto Rican and black gangs, both vying for control and targeting the new Russian immigrants. The violence was intense, with both sides suffering knife wounds, but Boris and his cohorts gradually pushed their rivals out of Brighton Beach. His fierce reputation grew, especially after he reclaimed the full value of smuggled diamonds from a hustler who tried to rip him off. This act of retribution earned Boris an invitation to meet Evsei Agron, the reigning crime lord of Brighton Beach and a former thief-in-law from Leningrad. Agron, a complex figure who survived the brutal siege of Leningrad and served time in Soviet prisons, became Boris's mentor. Agron's reputation was built on both rumors of murder and confirmed acts of pickpocketing and financial fraud, making him a legend among his peers. Under Agron's guidance, Boris began to refine his criminal activities, initially operating as a freelancer before officially joining Agron's crew. This period saw Boris involved in jewel thefts, arson, and robberies, with occasional trips to Europe for more lucrative heists. Despite the lack of a strict hierarchy, the Russian Jewish mob in Brighton Beach, often referred to as the Organizatsiya, functioned as a brotherhood of opportunistic criminals. Boris quickly became Agron's main enforcer, known for his violent methods and fearless demeanor. The gang's primary revenue came from protection rackets, or roof operations, where Boris and his cousin collected money from businesses across Brighton Beach, Coney Island, and beyond. Their feared reputation was cemented in the mid-1980s when an 18-year-old was killed during a brawl, a death that Boris diffused diplomatically with the victim's father. Agron's empire expanded, and by the mid-1980s, Russian gangsters were thriving in Brighton Beach, enjoying opulent lifestyles funded by their criminal enterprises. Boris's personal life also flourished. He met his second wife, a Ukrainian Jewish woman from Kharkiv, thanks to his unexpected ballroom dancing skills. His intelligence, cultural inclinations, and reading of Dostoevsky set him apart from the stereotypical gangster image, yet life was far from peaceful for Boris. Constant threats and rivalries marked his existence, especially during the protection racket war with Boris Goldberg's crew. In 1984, Evsei Agron, his mentor, survived a headshot, signaling the end of their good times. The chaos that followed saw Agron fade into the background as Marat Balagula, a shrewd Ukrainian immigrant and former Soviet economics student, rose to power. Balagula, initially underestimated, emerged as a significant figure in the organized crime landscape. Despite his jumpy and nervous demeanor, he quickly expanded his influence, leveraging his connections and intelligence. One of his most notorious schemes was the fuel tax scam, a complex daisy chain operation that defrauded the US government out of gasoline tax dollars. This scam, involving the cooperation of the Italian mafia, brought in massive profits, estimated at billions annually. Boris and Balagula's partnership flourished, with Boris providing muscle and Balagula orchestrating the financial maneuvers. Their operations were not without peril. On May 4th, 1985, Agron was assassinated, and suspicion swirled around various factions. Boris, loyal to Agron, denied any involvement and suspected another killer, Vladimir Reznikov. Despite the turmoil, Boris and Balagula continued their criminal enterprises, pulling off a major diamond heist in Antwerp worth $1.5 million. Boris's life, however, was a constant dance with danger. In December 1985, he survived an assassination attempt by Reznikov, who used an Uzi in a brazen daylight attack. To escape the immediate danger, Boris was convinced by Balagula to oversee a diamond mine in Sierra Leone, a challenging and remote assignment. Despite the harsh conditions, Boris found some success, even winning a substantial bet, but the call of vengeance and business pulled him back to New York. Upon his return, he was drawn into more criminal activities, including a failed attempt to eliminate Reznikov, who then threatened Balagula for a cut of the gas tax scam profits. The situation was diffused by Anthony Gaspipe Casso of the Lucchese crime family, who had Reznikov killed. Boris's criminal ventures expanded globally as he teamed up with Riccardo Fancini, a smooth and sophisticated mobster operating across Europe. They engaged in high-stakes smuggling and various scams, including a lucrative heroin trade and transporting high-quality Chinese white heroin from Thailand hidden in electronics. The heroin trade, despite its moral ambiguity, became a major part of his operations, smuggling the drug through Poland to the US. By 1990, Boris was the most dominant Russian mobster in America, embroiled in a fierce rivalry with Monia Elson. Elson, a former friend, had risen through the criminal ranks from Moldova, and their falling out led to a violent feud. Despite Boris's dismissive attitude towards Elson, viewing him as a fake thief-in-law, their conflict was intense and bloody. On New Year's Eve 1991, a car bomb intended for Boris failed to detonate, sparking a series of retaliatory attacks. Boris claimed someone else ordered the hit, but he acknowledged the ongoing war with Elson, comparing it to a Tom and Jerry episode where both constantly tried to kill each other. As their feud escalated, both men survived multiple assassination attempts. Boris hired a special forces gangster to eliminate Elson, who had been contracted by a Berlin-based mobster to kill Boris and take over his heroin operation. This Berlin gangster was later murdered, highlighting the lethal nature of Boris's world. The violence extended to failed hits on Monia, who also targeted other Russian gangsters before fleeing to LA. Boris recounted how their war continued for a year, with each trying to kill the other. Despite the chaos, Boris managed to navigate through these turbulent times, but his troubles with the law caught up to him. By the early 1990s, the DEA was closing in. Boris's narcotics operations faced scrutiny, leading to his arrest at his Staten Island mansion. Facing serious charges, Boris struck a deal, confessing to attempting to kill Elson and potentially providing information on others. This period marked a significant breakdown in organized crime, with many mafiosos cutting deals. Boris, though enjoying his time in US prisons compared to Soviet ones, served 4 years and returned to a life of protection rackets and solving disputes. He partnered with Yaponchik, a reputed thief-in-law, providing protection for Russians returning to do business in the chaotic 1990s Russia. Japonchik, though not the mythic figure some reports suggested, was still a formidable ally. Their partnership underscored Boris's ability to survive and thrive amidst the violent power struggles of Russian organized crime. Even as Japonchik was eventually arrested and deported, Boris continued his ventures. He aligned with a Kurdish Yazidi gangster, overseeing protection operations until his ally was assassinated during disputes over the Sochi Olympics rackets. In the early 2000s, Boris's criminal activities expanded to more legal businesses, enjoying a high life in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Odessa. However, he couldn't escape his criminal past for long. Involved with Riccardo Fanchini in counterfeit cigarette trafficking and money laundering, Boris was eventually arrested by the DEA and a UK task force. Despite taking a plea deal and serving time, Boris emerged resilient, continuing to engage in protection jobs and minor criminal activities. Released in 2014, Boris returned to New York, only to get embroiled in a convoluted murder-for-hire plot that led to his final arrest. By this time, he was a 67-year-old ex-mobster, longing for a fresh start, but constrained by his past and legal restrictions. And that's the wild story of Boris Nayfeld. If you enjoyed it, hit like, subscribe for more crazy tales, and drop a comment with your thoughts. Catch you in the next one, Secret Sleuths.